For years, the cartel's jungle fortress seemed untouchable. A billion-dollar fentanyl operation buried so deep beneath the canopy that even satellites struggled to find it. Guards patrolled with heavy weapons, trucks came and went under strict watch, and its bosses believed no one could touch their crown jewel. But what happens when these criminal empires come face to face with the deadliest machines in the sky? And how did the drug war reach a point where fighter jets became part of the playbook? This is the story of 12 American jets launching a massive strike, and the cartel never saw it coming. The White House changed the rules of the war on cartels on January 20th, 2025. What was once a fight led by police and prosecutors suddenly became a war that the government said it would fight with every tool it has. An executive order reclassified key Mexican cartels as terrorist groups, a move that turned drug bosses into enemies of the state. This was not a small legal tweak. It rewrote how Washington could chase, freeze, and strike at cartel networks. That legal flip did two big things at once. First, it lets prosecutors use anti-terror laws that carry far heavier penalties and reach far wider than ordinary drug charges. Second, it gave the Pentagon and intelligence services new authorities to act in ways they could not before. The definition of material support under the new framework is broad. Pay protection money? Help a smuggler move bundles of cash through cartel territory. Even a relative wiring money back home could be swept up under the new rules. And that can mean years behind bars. The government has already used these designations to bring terrorism-style charges in U.S. courts. The first test came fast. Maria del Rosario Navarro Sanchez was indicted under the new regime. Authorities say she funneled grenades to the Jalisco New Generation cartel, moved migrants and guns, and helped hide money and drugs. In court filings, prosecutors even highlighted a gold-colored AR-15 tied to her network. Her arrest wasn't just about one woman, it was a warning shot. If one supplier could be branded a terrorist, entire supply chains and family ties suddenly looked criminal in a whole new way. The military shift was just as stark. Officials told reporters the Pentagon and Special Operations were ordered to plan options once barred by older rules. The CIA was given more room to run covert moves overseas. In practice, that meant U.S. commanders began drafting plans that once only applied to foreign battlefields: fast raids, precision strikes, and snatch-and-grab missions. The legal box that had tied military planners was open. Now the same playbook used against Al-Qaeda or ISIS could be adapted to chase cartel commanders. Intelligence and surveillance followed. Where once satellites and drones watched deserts and battlefields in faraway places, they now focused on Mexico's borderlands. Reports say drones and SIGINT teams were retasked to trace leaders, map labs, and monitor the routes that moved drugs and cash. Banks and financial crime units used the new designations to squeeze cartel money channels. Together, these tools made hiding harder. Heat signatures, cell tower triangulation, and money trails started to pin down people who had long thought themselves invisible. The human effect was immediate. Cartel leaders who once moved with swagger started whispering. Safe houses emptied overnight. Convoys changed routes. Men who had run borders for years argued in intercepted calls about whether to flee, hide, or fight. That fear spread faster than any strike. In a way, the designation did what arrest could not. It turned paranoia into a weapon, fracturing trust inside cartels and making coordination dangerous. Still, words on paper and the hum of a drone don't win wars by themselves. To make words bite, on the evening of July 31st, a Tu-2S Dragon Lady lifted off from Beale Air Force Base, its transponder blinking like an honest witness. On the screens across North America, it looked routine. In truth, it was anything but. This Cold War spy plane, once meant to spot Soviet missiles, was heading for the most dangerous corner of Mexico on a mission that would bend the rules of the drug war. 6 hours later, it banked over Baja California, high enough that the horizon curved. From 70,000 feet, the Dragon Lady didn't need to cross a border. Its lenses read the ground like a book. Roads, trucks, trailers, small hideouts. All of it came into focus. Cameras caught license plates. Antennas scooped up radio chatter. Signals that once slipped through the cracks were suddenly visible. What used to be rumors turned into points on a map. Back at base, analysts treated those points like living things. A pickup became a pattern. A trail of footprints turned into a route. The data poured in, and people leaned in, generals, spies, agents, and prosecutors looking at the same bright dots. They stopped arguing about the possibility and started planning around the proof. If you could see the spine of the smuggling network, maybe you could snap it. The effect was immediate. The Pentagon ordered more flights. Where one mission used to be routine each month, 18 sorties flew in 10 days. But the sky had even more new hunters. Navy P-8 Poseidons, planes built to find submarines in the Pacific, suddenly prowled desert borderlands. Their big radars, once bent on periscopes and torpedoes, now scanned for the faint signals of cartel life. A P-8 can sweep hundreds of miles with multi-mode radar and pick up radio bursts, phone chatter, and the tiny signatures of vehicle convoys. It carries cameras that read license plates at long range, infrared that finds body heat at night, and data links that push live feeds to analysts who never stop watching. Each P-8 is a flying bank of sensors, long-range radar, electro-optical and infrared cameras, and suites that collect signals intelligence. They loiter for hours and talk to satellites and ground stations. A plane can watch a road all night and hand the evidence to people who can act by morning. For cartels that move goods under the cover of darkness, the P-8 erased that night. Above them, U-2s painted the fine lines. Cruising at extreme height, U-2s use synthetic aperture radar to map through clouds and at night. They can peel back tree cover, find hidden compounds, and trace tunnels. Where the P-8 shows the shape of a network, the U-2 reveals the details. Tire tracks, a secret airstrip, the exact layout of a buried lab. Together, these flights layered wide reach with surgical detail. The data poured into fusion centers, rooms of screens and people who never slept. Terabytes flowed every hour. Algorithms sifted noise. Analysts linked phone pings to cash drops to truck sightings. Those linkages became dossiers, then target packages. Names, times, and coordinates rode a chain from analysts to commanders. The machine turned raw images into possible strikes. F-22 Raptors slipped into forward bases in Arizona and Texas. Stealth made them hard to see. Super Cruise let them sprint without loud afterburners. Their sensors fused radar, infrared, and electronic signals into one shared picture. Pilots could lock a single vehicle or compound and deliver precision weapons meant to limit harm to bystanders. The idea was surgical hits. Remove a command node, disable a lab, then vanish before the world knew what happened. Then comes the unprecedented gambit. In a single pre-dawn operation that stuns the world, Mexico rounds up 29 imprisoned drug lords from facilities across the country and loads them onto planes bound for 8 different American cities. The images are surreal. Blacked-out vans glide into quiet prisons. Men once caged in concrete step into blindfolds and handcuffs. Mexican Marines and federal police move with military precision. Helicopters circle. At dawn, transport planes lift off, each one heavy with men who had thought themselves untouchable. By noon, cells in Los Angeles, Phoenix, Houston, Miami, Dallas, Atlanta, Chicago, and New York hold the very bosses the U.S. had hunted for decades. Rafael Carocano, the man tied to the 1985 murder of DEA agent Enrique Camarena, a crime that poisoned relations between the United States and Mexico for decades, is finally being handed over to American courts. Alongside him march Vicente Correa-Fuentes, once the head of the Juarez Cartel, and the notorious Trevino Morales brothers. This is no ordinary legal moment. It reads like a turning point in the fight against organized crime. Mike Vigil, a former DEA operations chief, called the move historic, a clear sign of Mexico's desperation to avoid economic punishment. He's right to stress how unusual this is. Normally, Mexico sends prisoners across the border one at a time after long legal steps. Shipping 29 people at once breaks from that pattern. It is without recent precedent. The whole effort runs like a military operation. High-risk inmates are pulled from different prisons at exactly the same time, so their allies can't stage rescues or delays. Each transfer moves under heavy guard to military airfields where American planes stand ready. Logistics strain every link in the plan. Prisoners must be routed to different U.S. judicial districts to face charges specific to where their crimes took place. Every moment is timed. As the convoys move, a top Mexican delegation, including Foreign Affairs Secretary Juan Ramón de la Fuente, sits in Washington to meet with Secretary of State Marco Rubio. The overlap is not by accident. It signals seriousness while talks are still underway. These extraditions act as leverage. In return, the United States pauses talk of harsh tariffs for 30 days, giving both governments a narrow window to sketch out a broader security plan. Mexico agrees to send in more troops and to press harder against fentanyl labs. It is a fragile truce built on hard choices, but far from conference tables, a more dangerous scene stirs. Deep inside Sinaloa's dense green, American surveillance has already picked out a fresh target. The big question hangs: if diplomacy collapses, will stealth fighters be used to finish what talks cannot? The jungle hides a factory. Inside, vats boil with chemicals, and masked hands measure powder that will be packed and pushed north. Trucks sit on unmarked tracks, ready to carry the load. The site looks like a fortress. No clear roads get close, and those who come near rarely return. Above it all, 12 F-22 fighters slice through the sky almost without sound. From 30,000 feet, the pilots see only a blur of green and cloud, but their instruments lock on the coordinates. Each jet carries small, precise bombs meant to strike a single spot and limit harm to nearby people. Orders are plain: destroy the lab while trying to avoid collateral harm. There will be no warning, no chance to bargain. If the mission goes forward, it will be swift, cold, and exact. A surgical end to a threat that has already killed too many. Families on both sides watch the outcome with tense, weary hope quietly. Back in Mexico, the response is darker. Cartels view the mass extraditions as a betrayal. For some groups, it is the final provocation. Roadblocks blossom on highways. Bridges choke with burning tires. Small towns that relied on cartel cash suddenly feel the cold sweep of uncertainty. Mid-level lieutenants smell power. Some move quickly to seize territory. Others split and go rogue. In American cities, law enforcement braces for blowback. Federal marshals tighten security at courthouses. Neighborhoods with large Mexican communities hold tense vigils and protests. Some fear reprisals on U.S. soil. Others fear the deepening reach of cartel networks inside their towns. FBI agents trace money, guns, and phone records at a frantic pace. The streets do not erupt into chaos overnight, but the threat hangs like thunder. The larger effect is quieter and more dangerous. Removing kings does not shut down the trade. It opens a vacancy. New players, younger, hungrier, and often more brutal, push to fill it. Supply routes splinter. Labs move faster. Violence flares in new pockets nobody expected. Politically, Scheinbaum's gamble wins her breathing room. For a moment, she deflects talk of invasion. Markets calm. Trade talks resume. But the bargain is brittle. The U.S. now holds cartel leaders and proof of networks. Mexico's pride is intact on the surface, but the true cost may be hidden in ruined towns and broken families. Most important, the trade keeps flowing because demand still exists. For every boss hauled onto a plane, a dozen others watch, learn, and adapt. The spectacle of extradition may buy months of quiet. It cannot by itself end a business built on appetite, money, and terror. The sky had changed the rules. The ground would decide whether those new rules meant real change or just a new round in a fight that has no easy ending. But how did we get to a point where billion-dollar cartels control vast criminal empires and entire nations wage war against them? The story of Mexico's drug cartels reads like a slow-burning disaster. Big money, bad choices, and violence that keeps growing. In the 1930s, marijuana wasn't yet the global political flashpoint it would later become. But it was starting to make waves in the United States, especially in the Southwest. Many Mexican immigrants brought the plant with them, using it for recreation and, in some cases, traditional medicine. But it didn't take long for prejudice and fear to mix into the picture. Anti-Mexican sentiment was already high, and the growing popularity of marijuana became another excuse for politicians and the press to stir public fear. Wild claims about its dangerous effects filled newspapers, and before long, the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 was passed. This law didn't outright ban marijuana, but it made it so heavily taxed and restricted that it might as well have been illegal. That, of course, didn't stop people from wanting it. If anything, the restrictions pushed the trade underground, creating the perfect environment for illicit trafficking to grow. Quietly, the first networks of what would later become powerful smuggling routes began to take shape along the US-Mexico border. By the 1960s and 1970s, the situation had transformed entirely. Marijuana wasn't just a niche product anymore. It had become a symbol of rebellion for America's growing counterculture. College campuses, music festivals, and anti-war protests often had marijuana in the mix. But it wasn't alone. Cocaine and heroin were making their way into the US in greater quantities, and psychedelics like LSD were becoming just as popular among the young and disillusioned. Part of the reason for this explosion was the global drug trade itself. International cartels, especially in Colombia and Mexico, began to realize just how big the US market could be. These cartels had the resources, manpower, and smuggling expertise to move massive quantities of drugs into the country. Marijuana shipments grew larger, cocaine routes became more sophisticated, and heroin began arriving through well-protected channels. What had once been small-scale smuggling was now an organized, multi-million-dollar operation. The United States government watched this rapid growth with alarm. Law enforcement agencies struggled to keep up, and public concern over addiction and crime kept rising. Then, in 1971, President Richard Nixon made an announcement that would shape drug policy for decades, the official start of the war on drugs. Standing before reporters, Nixon declared drug abuse to be public enemy number one and promised to use every tool the government had to fight it. This wasn't just political theater. Nixon's declaration meant more federal funding for drug enforcement, tougher penalties for trafficking, and an expansion of agencies like the DEA, which would be created just a few years later in 1973. Marijuana, heroin, and cocaine were now seen as top priorities for law enforcement, and efforts to intercept them at the border became more aggressive. But the war on drugs also had another, less expected effect. It made the trafficking business even more profitable for cartels. The harder it became to get drugs into the US, the more valuable they became. Cartels adapted quickly, finding new smuggling routes, bribing officials, and investing in faster, stealthier transportation methods. Every crackdown seemed to make the networks more creative and more resilient. By the mid-1970s, the stage was set for an all-out battle between law enforcement and the drug trade, a battle that would only escalate in the decades to come. What began with a few loads of marijuana in the 1930s had grown into a global industry, powered by international cartels, driven by enormous profits, and deeply woven into the political and social fabric of both the United States and Latin America. And as history would prove, this was only the beginning. The 1980s brought a drug crisis that would change everything: the cocaine epidemic. Colombian powerhouses like the Medellin and Cali cartels rose to frightening dominance, raking in billions by flooding the US with cocaine. Using routes through the Caribbean and Central America, they moved their product with military precision, outsmarting authorities at nearly every turn. At first, cocaine had a glamorous reputation, sold as the party drug of the rich and famous. But that image shattered when crack cocaine hit the streets. Crack was cheap, easy to use, and incredibly addictive. Suddenly, cocaine wasn't just a high society luxury. It was everywhere, especially in struggling urban neighborhoods. The result was devastating. Addiction rates soared, crime spiraled, and poverty deepened as entire communities fell under the drug's grip. The US government couldn't ignore the crisis. In 1986, the Reagan administration passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, introducing strict mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses. But there was a controversial twist. The penalties for crack cocaine were far harsher than for powdered cocaine, even though they were essentially the same drug in different forms. This sentencing gap hit low-income communities and people of color the hardest. Families were torn apart as nonviolent offenders received long prison terms, and the justice system faced accusations of bias. What was meant as a strike against cartels ended up causing deep and lasting damage in neighborhoods already struggling to survive. At the center of the 1980s cocaine epidemic was Rafael Caro Quintero, a man who built huge farms, moved massive loads, and taught future traffickers how to run an empire from the shadows. He helped open the Colombia-Mexico pipeline that sent cocaine north into U.S. cities, and his methods, pay the right officials, build giant plantations, and crush any threats, set the pattern for decades to come. Those old rules worked because the police and politicians were weak or corrupt, and the profit was huge. Caro Quintero's Guadalajara cartel ran trucks and planes loaded with drugs while paying off officials and buying silence. When rivals tried to move in, he responded not with deals but with murder. That raw mix of profit and terror is how modern cartels learn to act like private armies wrapped in business suits. The killing of DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena in 1985 showed how far the cartels would go. Camarena had been sniffing around a massive marijuana ranch and the men behind it. He was kidnapped, tortured for hours, and killed. A brutal message aimed at the United States as much as at Mexico. The murder shocked both countries and pushed the U.S. to step up pressure, which in turn pushed traffickers to hide smarter and hit harder. The Camarena case hardened borders and deepened the war that would follow. Prisons and courts did not end these networks. Caro Quintero spent years locked up, but in 2013, a Mexican court freed him on a legal technicality. He vanished, regrouped, and kept pulling strings from the mountains for years until authorities captured him again in the 2020s. The cycle, arrest, release, rebuild, is one reason cartels can survive for generations. It also shows how fragile legal systems became when millions of dollars were on the table. The violence ratcheted up even further when trained soldiers brought war skills into the criminal world. Los Zetas began as a band of deserters from Mexico's elite forces who were hired to protect and expand a cartel. They turned into one of the most violent groups the country had ever seen, using military tactics, armored trucks, and shock tactics that froze towns in fear. When a group uses army training to run a crime business, ordinary life becomes a battlefield. Other cartels followed different paths but ended in the same place: more blood. The Juarez cartel rose to power by owning the crossings into El Paso, the highways, bridges, and lanes where huge sums changed hands. Its leader, Amado Carrillo Fuentes, earned the nickname Lord of the Skies for using a fleet of planes to move drugs. When he died during a plastic surgery attempt to change his face in 1997, his death left a power gap. That gap helped trigger a brutal turf war, one wave of which turned Ciudad Juarez into one of the deadliest places on earth between 2008 and 2012, costing roughly 10,000 lives in that period alone. So by the time the 2000s arrived, cartels had become more than just drug smugglers. They had evolved into sprawling, multi-headed criminal empires with interests far beyond narcotics. Extortion rackets, human trafficking networks, and even illegal mining operations filled their portfolios. They didn't just make money, they bought influence. Politicians, police officers, and local officials often fell under their control, some willingly, others out of sheer fear. When governments tried to push back, the cartels adapted with frightening speed. They invested in encrypted communication systems that made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to track them. They used shell companies and complex financial networks to launder billions in profits. They built hidden bunkers and fortified safe houses, turning entire neighborhoods into strongholds. And they weren't afraid to fight back. Armed with military-grade weapons, they transformed cities and highways into war zones. Convoys of cartel gunmen, sometimes wearing stolen police or military uniforms, would storm rivals' territory or ambush security forces in broad daylight. In places like Ciudad Juarez and Tijuana, bodies would be left hanging from bridges or dumped in public spaces. Chilling warnings meant to terrorize anyone who dared to oppose them. The violence wasn't just about power, it was a tool of business. By intimidating communities, they kept trafficking routes open and witnesses silent. And while Mexico bore the brunt of the bloodshed, the impact rippled far beyond its borders. The drugs kept flowing north, and the money, weapons, and demand kept flowing south, feeding a cycle that neither side could seem to break. In recent years, the problem has grown even more complex. The fentanyl crisis has made trafficking deadlier than ever. Cartels like Sinaloa and Jalisco New Generation now operate on a global scale, sourcing chemicals from Asia, manufacturing synthetic opioids in Mexico and shipping them into the U.S. hidden in everything from cars to commercial cargo. Overdose deaths have soared, and law enforcement agencies warn that these groups are no longer just criminal syndicates. They operate more like insurgent armies with international reach. By the late 2010s, these realities had pushed the conversation in Washington to a new level. The cartels weren't just a drug problem, they were a national security threat. Their ability to corrupt institutions, control territory, and cause mass casualties was beginning to look less like organized crime and more like terrorism. This growing threat, combined with the relentless flow of drugs into the U.S., is what led President Donald Trump to take the unprecedented step of declaring Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. His reasoning was simple: if they operate like terrorists, they should be treated like terrorists. But this move sparked immediate controversy. Supporters argued it would give the U.S. more legal tools to dismantle cartel networks. Critics warned it could strain relations with Mexico, trigger unintended military action, and blur the line between combating crime and waging war. The question remains, is treating cartels as terrorists a necessary step toward ending their power, or a dangerous shift in policy with consequences we can't yet predict?